We're going to draw a small cherry tomato and really try and create realistic lighting effects over it using pastel pencils. I'll have a full list of the materials down below, as well as a free ebook with everything you need written down inside it, so do download that. And I'm working on Clairefontaine pastel mat paper in white today. And just a quick note that if you decide to do this on a different colour of pastel mat, it's going to change how your pencils show up. So if you're struggling, then that might be the reason. So what I'd really like to focus on is how we can bring a sense of realism into the work, specifically using colour and value. Value is your light and your dark, so obviously we'll have reflections, our lightest lights here, and then we have our shadows, our darkest darks. And that will really help us to create an illusion of a 3D form. However, there are lots of lovely things happening within the tomato, where we have reflected light at the bottom, we have this lovely shadow going across the middle, and then of course the brighter red on the top, which is being contrasted by the green as well. And there are a few different things that we do there to make sure that these shadows feel almost vibrant and rounded. If we don't use colour in the correct way for those areas, then actually these shadows end up feeling flat and somewhat out of place. So we do need to get our colour choices correct there, and I'm going to talk you through that when we make it to that stage. So downloading the free ebook, you'll be able to find the full materials list, and I'll put the pencils on the screen for you as we go as well. And you'll also find the reference photo, which is from Lach on Pexels, and that will also be linked in there. I'm going to begin with the 305. These are all Stabilo Carbothello pencils today to make it easy. And I'm just going to start by shading in all of the areas of red, really keeping it quite simple to start with. So what I quite like to do is begin by marking things out. What I'm going to avoid filling in are these really bright reflections to begin with. The really bright reflections need to remain quite clean. If we start to muddy them really early on, we won't get them light enough by the end. So I'm just going to shade around all of this area. Now my outline shows where I have my big structures. So we have the big shadow at the bottom, the shadow across the middle, and the two reflections. But I am going to shade in the shadows as well. Now the reason I'm just doing it slightly separately is so that I can change my pencil direction and keep a vague eye on where those sections actually sit within the tomato. And then once I'm happy with that, I can change my grip to over the top of the pencil, as you can see, and that allows me to use this side of the pencil, and I can start to fill in the tooth of the card more fully. For smaller areas at the side, swapping back to a normal grip is useful, but I still sweep the pencil on and off the page for those areas to try and ensure that I get some soft edges where we can blend the different sections together. There'll also be plenty of different colours heading into all of these sections, so although we are filling in the tooth of the card mostly, don't get to the point where you've got lots of dust coming off the page. That probably means that you've gone just a step too far for this beginning step. So just leaving this shadow in the middle ever so slightly less well filled in just allows me to see where it is, and it will give me a little bit more space in the tooth of the card there to put my other colours in. I have some shadows that are going to be cast by the leaves as well. And I'm going to make sure already at this early stage that I give myself a lovely soft hazy edge to the inside of these reflections. I'm using the pencil in very small swirling motions to do that, and you can see it goes nice and hazy. So last little bit. This is a really brilliant red for this project. But if you don't have the Stabilo set, then inside the ebook you will find a pencil comparison chart, and you can use that to match the pencils I'm using with pencils from Faber Castell, as well as a couple of random ones from other sets too. From there, I'm going to go in with my darkest darks. So I'm not using black for this. For me, it felt a little bit harsh. Instead, I'm going in with the 635. This is actually a brown, but a very dark brown, and it shows up particularly dark over the white paper. So as I said at the beginning, when you're working on a different colour of paper to me, you will find that these pencils show up differently. And if we're working, for example, on quite a dark value of paper, you can sometimes find that a pencil which looks particularly dark on the white ends up looking lighter on a darker value paper, and potentially you can see more colours in it too. Sometimes that is of course really useful, and sometimes it's really annoying. So again, if you did this on a different value and colour, then you might need to adjust your pencil choices. So what I'm doing is picking out in a very general manner the darks of the stalk and the little leaves. Already this is going to begin to give us a lovely structure. What I'm doing is only picking out the shadows. We'll be going in with some green on here as well, you'll be happy to hear, but that goes in later. What we're doing at the moment is creating for the leaves and the stalk a very basic two-tone drawing, and it's quite easy to do from this photograph because the lighting is fairly severe over these areas. So we get some very clean shadows that are quite easy to pick out and give us an easy to find structure. So this leaf up here, the only bit of shadow we've really got is towards the top. You can leave these finer bits out if you think you're going to smudge them with your hand as you're working, and you can put them in later, of course. So we're going to end up with something like that for the top, but keep this pencil in hand and we will start to work on the shadow at the bottom. So the shadow at the bottom is going to go from the tomato into the table. And it comes further over the right-hand side over here than it does to the left. It just comes a little bit further up the side of the tomato. Now I'm being quite light with the pencil. We've got a lot of work, as you can see, to get to this stage over here. But we want to start with these very basic shapes. Nice and light motions. We really don't need a lot of pressure. We get a lot of pigment out of this very, very easily. And you can see I've just dragged that down into the table. And that has joined those two sections together. That's called massing when we do this. When we join two separate areas, two different objects together using the value of them, we are massing them together. So starting with this 645, I'm now going to work on the other shadows that aren't quite as intense as they are at the bottom. You can see straight away that this pencil has much more colour in it, but as much as it is heading towards red, it's quite a purple red, and this is going to become really important later on. So do make sure that you get the right pencil. So I'm going to begin in the middle, so that I can start to bring a little bit more form into our tomato, which at the moment feels quite flat. Now you'll notice that my pencil is blunt already. That's exactly how I like it for these kinds of areas where you can see I'm just very, very gently swirling my pencil around and creating an area of very soft shadow. So I'm filling in the paper quite well. It's being mixed into the cherry red that we've already used, but it's also creating a very soft edge because the pencil is blunt. The sharper the pencil, the harder it is to get that effect, and you'd basically just be working at it for a little bit longer. So I sharpened up a few of my pencils before beginning, but mostly pencils that I need for this area up here, where we have a little bit of detail work to do and some finer edges. So this shadow, you can see, again, it comes around towards the right because our light is coming probably from about here. So it's on the left-hand side. And then I'm just varying the pressure through the pencil as I work so that I can be a little bit lighter and softer with it, where I don't need it to show up as much. And then of course, press harder where I want it to show up more. So already I'm starting to create some lovely edge work here on these shadows, which are being cast by the stalk and the leaves. I'm going to come down to the shadow again. Now I'm being quite light with the pencil, just working around the edges once more, having a little look at the shape, kind of droops down a little bit here, soft edges, make sure that it's nicely filled in the centre of this shape. Can glaze over the top with some of the red if we need to, which I probably will. And then I'll come to the shadow at the bottom. So I'm going to start by working along the edge, and I'm putting almost no pressure through the pencil. And you can see already I've blended it into the really dark brown and blending it out into the red at the same time. So again, honestly, no pressure is really required for this. Lots of small circles. If we didn't use small circles, we do tend to end up with quite a lot of shading marks and they don't mix together quite as well. But you can use your finger or a blending tool, like a soft tool, to blend things together too. But when you're working in a fairly small area, as we are here, and I want to keep the card as clean as possible around it, we'll see how that goes, then I would prefer to use the pencils themselves to blend things together. I just find I have a little bit more control. Let's pull it over the top of this dark brown here so I don't end up with a hard edge. Now, I will edit this bit out, but I'm going to give this a strong tap and a blow off. Okay, so I've just got rid of some excess and we're going to do this as we work. I would then like you to get your putty rubber and very carefully you can dab the putty rubber on the surface to lift off any loose pastel before rubbing it in. You want to lift the pastel off as much as possible to start with. The more that you rub it, if that pastel is loose, especially on white card, you're actually going to smudge it into the page and you'll really see that, and then you can't get rid of it. So just try lifting it with the putty rubber first. So I'm just going to do a tiny bit more work at the bottom, just making sure this shadow is nicely blended out. And then I'm going to work on the shadow which is being cast by our tomato onto the table. So I'm sweeping the pencil on and off the page, really, really light. We'll do more work on this later on. Again, the shadow needs to drag further over to the right. And we're already starting to get a nice sense of weight to our fruit. So as I said at the start, there are a lot of colours that really need to go into this to actually bring the 3D illusion together. Usually when we're talking about 3D illusions, we're talking about light and dark and our values more, but colour is also important. So we're now going to start to put in the reflected light. Now in the original reference photo from Lach on Pexels, you can see that the surrounding area is a vivid yellow, which could have of course gone in at the editing stage, and that we have quite a warm orangey yellow reflected light therefore in the area just here between our two shadows, and that is being bounced off the desk or the table that it's sat on. So we're going to put that in nice and lightly. We're going to be glazing backwards and forwards from now on, and I'm going to start with a 2-2-1, which you can see is this lovely orange colour. It's already really blunt, which again is what I want for this stage because I want it to be nice and soft. So I'm going to start on the right hand side, and once more start with as little pressure as you can and see how much pastel comes out, because you might be surprised. We don't want to turn this absolutely bright yellow or orange. It's more of a slow effect. So I'm just going to gently run this around the tomato. I don't want to see where this pencil officially starts and where it finishes. I want it to be really, really smoothly woven in. So blunt pencil, lift the pencil on and off the page if you're sweeping it, and if you're moving it in small circles, just make sure that your pressure is nice and light. Now for this section, I can really carefully take my finger in there. Make sure that if you do that, obviously your finger is now dirty, make sure that you don't touch it to the page. Okay, so coming back to my reference photo, I'm going to see where I'd like to make more intense. So this is up to you. I just want to make an area of this reflected light a bit bolder, and that prevents our shape getting flattened. Because if we made the light the same intensity all the way around, then it suggests that the shape is completely flat instead of curving and getting a different interaction with light in different areas. A bit more on this edge. So I'm just putting a touch more pressure through my pencil to do this, and then getting lighter and lighter as I draw the orange backwards into the rest of the tomato. So don't worry about the edges being grainy, they can be cleared up at the end. With this pencil still in hand, I'm now going to work into these grainy edges that we gave ourselves earlier. So this is starting to work into the bright reflections. Try not to bring that pencil into this area of white quite yet. That area will naturally get smaller and smaller really easily, and we want to try and leave it as large as possible for as long as possible, and then we can encroach into it and make it the size that we would like it to be. The reason for that is if we make it too small too quickly, you can't get the bright cleanliness of that white back. It's really, really difficult, especially when you're working on white card. So just bringing some of this orange over on the left. I will be putting other colours into there. This bit isn't going to stay completely orange, but I would like a little bit. You can see some just over on this edge, making that white reflection a little bit too small, so I've got to try and keep this pencil out of there. Can you see how that's just got smaller? It's okay, but I would have liked it a little bit bigger. All right, it is starting to come together, believe it or not. So, as I said, we're going to be glazing backwards and forwards. So I'd like you to pick up your red again now, and we'll go in with the 305. So working again in these small circles, it's a really great project for blending and for practicing your blending. We're going to head over some of these areas and just make the transitions even softer, but adding a bit of the hint of the red back in, because you've got to remember that although these purples and oranges do play a really important part in this drawing, overall we want the tomato to read as red, not orange or purple. So that is why I'm going to be moving, as I say, backwards and forwards between my pencils, getting a nice balance as I work. So this is where soft pastels and pastel pencils really do come into their own, because they are perfect for blending into each other. You don't need a blending medium like a solvent or water. You just use the medium and it naturally blends into itself really, really beautifully. And that's why it can work so well for doing animals and animal portraits, because you can get very soft details which lend themselves perfectly to the illusion of things like fur. So I'm adding a little bit of red in at the bottom. Feel free to just pause the video as I work to see where I'm adding the red in, and keep looking at your own work to see where you think you want to add more red in. So something that I'd like to draw your attention to as we're doing this, because this is what is so important about the colours that we're adding in, is that you'll notice the difference between the red and the orange on the page now seems quite small. And part of that is because we've blended them and glazed them together. The orange is no longer very much brighter, very much lighter in value than the red, because the orange has been mixed in with other things. Therefore, on the page, pretty much the orange and the red are only different from each other in colour. There is a value difference, but it's not huge. And so because of that, they are harder and harder to tell apart, and it allows things to blend and mould together without it looking flat. And this is why we need to weave in other colours. If we didn't, the tomato could end up looking very, very flat, being that we are working in colour. So again, I'm going to give this a tap and a blow off, and I'll see you back. So once more, I'm just dabbing my putty rubber around, lifting off any loose pastel. You really do want to do this as you work, otherwise all of these little bits that are getting stuck actually end up getting pushed into the page while you're working. So if we just have a look at the tomato I did earlier, you'll see that we're still quite a long way off from this lovely, very round, full feeling finish. And a lot of that is actually to do with the shadows, which need returning to, not so much the reflections, although the reflections of course need finishing, because at the moment they are just left as they are. So the secret here to getting these beautiful shadows is turning to purples. So basically what we've done is we've got red. Red is a neighbour to orange and also a neighbour to purple. And for the lighter areas, we have gone into the orange spectrum. And for the darker areas, we're turning over into the purple spectrum. It's something I do a lot, but it's also something that you can see in the reference photo if you really study it. Now, again, what I mentioned a moment ago is that the red and the orange are now sat together really nicely because their lightness, their value is very, very similar. But being that their colours are slightly different, we still get a nice, interesting bounce on the page. So this is what we're also going to do with our purples. So I've got two that I can use. I've got a darker one, the 330. This should sit quite nicely with the value of the shadow here. So what it's going to mean is the colours are different, but their values are quite similar, and we'll get a slight bouncing effect on the page. And then I have the 325, which is, as you can see, it's quite a pinky colour. And this can be used around the edges right next to and slightly into the actual red. So let's see how this comes together. Starting with the 330, again, it's nice and blunt. That is exactly how I want it to be. I'm going to begin to work over the top and around the edges of these shadows. And what you'll find is this has a lovely rounding effect over the tomato. And it's one of those things that you blink and you miss it. But if I hadn't told you about it, you'd probably sit and think there's something missing in my drawing. There's some sort of magic touch in this one that makes it feel more realistic and as though it's got a nice weight to it on the page. So once more, as is a theme, I am not pressing very hard, and I'm creating mixing movements because we still want to be mixing this with the browns that are underneath. This purple by itself would be too saturated, it would have too much colour. So we need the browns underneath, just to reduce the intensity of the colour so it can sit there quite quietly, so that we almost don't identify that there is purple in this until we start to have a bit of a look. And that is very similar to the photograph. So this shadow from the leaf very lightly rolls around and extends down. So I'm being so light with this pencil. Almost think of it like a blending tool at this stage. I'm going to twist my work so that I can get a nice easy angle on the tomato and not run my hand over everything. So this really is quite a forgiving process now. Because we're being careful and working in light layers, we can glaze backwards and forwards until we're happy with the different colours that we're putting down. So remember, it's a backwards and forwards process. I'm going to work between the 325 and the 305 now. So the 325, this pinky one, this works just around very lightly. We almost don't really need much of this at all. Just works around the edges of the shadow, where the shadow is going into the mid-tones, into these lovely reds and oranges. So it can just really lightly. Again, think of your pencils like a blending tool, as opposed to thinking about putting colour down with them. Not so much thinking about colouring in with these, just moving the pastel around. Super light, lifting the pencil off the page. You should be a pro blender by the time we get to the end of this project. So I just got rid of some of the excess dust, and now I'm ready to go back in again with the red. So the red is the pencil, because it's our local colour, it's the pencil that sort of holds the painting together, and you can use it to blend edges to their finished stage quite nicely. And you want to make sure that you continue to return to this so that the tomato, as I said, doesn't end up being pink or end up being purple by the end. This, our local colour, should be lightly woven into most areas of the tomato, especially around the top, which is where it is getting more light. So again, just glazing over the top where we have these slightly lighter shadows. I just keep blowing off the dust so that I don't get my page contaminated. So I've worked my way around all of those different sections to make sure that the red is helping to blend each little bit together. You can just see the need for a tiny bit more around these areas of light, which need to go in now. So you can see I've been really mindful about keeping these reflections nice and clean. As I said, if you don't keep them clean, then what's going to happen is they'll become too dull by the end. They're very easy to make darker if we need them darker, but they're not easy to get lighter. So we're going to put these reflections in, and I'm going to start with the reflection in the centre. Now this might seem really odd, but I'm going to begin with the white, which obviously you can't see. This is the 100. And I'm just going to put it over on the left-hand side where the reflection is brightest. And then I'm going to take the 681, just move those rolling pencils. This is a nice weak light pink, and again I'm going to start from the edges now in that small circular motion, and it's really lovely, as you can see, for creating an area of slightly lighter red with that ever so slightly matte finish that we have on a tomato. This tomato isn't shiny in the way that a waxy apple is, for example. It has a slightly matte quality to it. So I'm just working my way in slowly. And then as I get to that area where I've put the white down, you can see it's just a little bit lighter than the rest of it. So now, again, it's a backwards and forwards process. We can start to work back into the reflection. So I'm going to go in with the yellow-orange, the 221, very, very lightly, pop some more around on the right-hand edge. That's where I can see some in the photo. Just a little bit on the top. I'm going to take my lovely pinky colour again, the 325. I do have to keep checking all of these. I usually work in Faber Castell, and I don't know off by heart the Stabilo set yet. So I'm working this around the bottom where we have the shadow. And of course, the red itself, 305. Just going to bring the shadow ever so slightly further down. So that is the 330. So I'm using the purple colour to do that. And then outline it, as you can hopefully just about see in the photograph, with a tiny bit of red. Now I'm not outlining this with a hard line, remember. I'm working in very, very light scumbly layers. Return to the pink. Again, this is what I mean by backwards and forwards. So I go through all of those pencils, and then I can return to this pencil that I began the step with and just blend them all back together again. So the lighter you are with your pencil, the better this is going to work. So I want a really, really soft edge to all this. You've just got tiny hints of all these colours that we've been weaving in. Take the white again. Okay, so that's the central reflection. The one on the edge is a little bit funny. I don't really want to be making the centre of that any darker. So I'm going to go in with the 681 and just work over the edge but into the red. You can see I'm not dragging it into the area of white. So this sort of is like smeared down the side. Now remember, I put some orange down here earlier and I said there was going to be more happening. That's where we're bringing this 681 down. So I'm just sweeping this, thinking about moving it in the curve of the tomato, not in straight lines. And then as I sweep it further down, that's where it's going to meet more of the 221, which gets swept up into the bottom of that. So it goes from a kind of milky pink into a more saturated reflective light. So as I said, I made this reflection smaller than I wanted to. So I'm just going to cheekily start by working over the top of some of the pink and see if I can make it a little bit bigger. And then just sweep the pencil on and off the page. It should blend out into the pink for you quite nicely. Just work on this edge until I'm happy with it. So this is the pink again, taking the reflected light all the way over to the outer edge. I'm going to stop fiddling with that. I'm going to put the leaves in and then we will return to a couple of areas such as the shadow at the bottom as well as around the edge of the shadows within the tomato. So I'm going to use the 585. This is a lovely deep mossy green and you want it quite sharp for this because we don't want to be making the leaves really, really thick. They've got quite spiky tips to them. So I just drew this outline freehand and the leaves are whatever shape they turn out to be. I would encourage you to do something similar. because if you are working on the white paper and you have these really fine and fiddly outlines, they can be quite tricky to fully fill in and get rid of the actual outline, and then you end up making the leaves thicker and thicker, a bit like when you try and cut your own fringe, Emily, and then it gets shorter and shorter because the bottom edge isn't straight. So what we don't want to happen is for these leaves to kind of overtake the whole painting and become too thick and heavy. So I'm filling in all of the spaces where I hadn't put the shadow, and then very gently just blending this green into the edges of the dark shadow. Do tap and blow your work off as you go. Again, this is a very dark pastel pencil, so we don't want it to accidentally travel around your work. So I'm going to pick up the original pencil for this area. It's really deep brown, really, really deep. And sweep it, again, it's a backwards and forwards kind of thing. Sweep it over the edges and make sure that the dark is properly joined into the green. You can also just swirl it right at the base, just here, like we did with the shadow at the bottom of the tomato, and just make sure that these two sections are joined together. Almost no pressure is needed through your pencil to achieve that. So for the areas on the leaves which are a little bit lighter and a little bit furry, I'm going to use the 681, which is the pink, and it will show up, if you're very light with it, it shows up just like a light grey. It's actually very weakly pigmented, so the colour in it, the pink in it, isn't very strong, and in most instances it doesn't really show up like a pink, it shows up like a warmish grey. So I'm not going into loads of detail for this section because I want the main focus to be the tomato itself. I'm going to very gently glaze over the whole back leaf, which is catching more light and is much softer and slightly out of focus because it's further away from us. Again, just work lightly with your pencil. You can always press harder, but if you go in pressing too hard, especially on a small drawing like this, it can be quite difficult to get rid of your mark if you're not happy with it. So once more, tap, blow off and clean up around your work. And we will come back to these leaves at the end to finish off the tips. So just leave those for now, don't fiddle with them because there is a little trick to getting those to sit nicely. All right, so as I said, I want to return to the shadows. I'd like to use the 330 and just move in small circular motions, again, a bit of a backwards and forwards thing, where we've put in reflections and highlights. We just want to make them nicely joined into everything else and reinstate the shadow if it's become, I don't know, a bit smaller than it should have or got a little bit too much colour in it for your liking. So this is quite a subjective step, if you like. Some people might want to fiddle with a few different areas of the tomato, and other people might really be quite happy with most of what they've done. So I'm mainly wanting to work with my purpley pinky colours and just extend and blend the shadows in a little bit better. So as I said, it is quite a forgiving process because I'm just working in lots of light layers. Stabilo Carbothello pencils are very, very soft, so they do sit over each other and over quite a lot of layers fairly well, whereas a pencil like Faber Castell kind of gives up in putting any pigment down after a while because it's a harder pencil, which is really great for some situations, but if you've got thick layers to work over, they don't show up as well as something like Stabilo or Caran d'Ache. A little bit more orange is required over here, a bit more reflected light on this edge. Again, nice blunt pencil. Just keep blowing my work off. And then I'm going to work on the shadow at the bottom. So not loads to do to this. I'm going to take the red, the 305, and move in some very little light layers. So I'm sweeping it with the pencil on the side into the shadow which is already there, and then just a little bit further out, just a little bit. I'm going to keep the shadow very, very simple for this because we're not putting a full background in. This is just a nice little study. So I'm going to take the 221. Not pressing it all hard. Want it nice and grainy. Again, there is a bit of trick to this, so I'll just show you that in a moment. All right, give a final tap or blow to your work before taking the putty rubber. So with the putty rubber, I want to first start by turning my drawing upside down and working very carefully in between the leaves. So I'll just speed this section up for you, but be nice and careful and reshape your putty rubber. I just noticed as I'm rubbing out a little bit of tomato that I just want it to come up a little bit further so it has a little bit of a fuller feel to it at the top. Just looking at the little study I've done and seeing that the leaves are sat a little bit further down, and for me, I prefer the shape that makes. I'm just using my red to basically make my tomato just a little bit bigger. All right, so having just made that small adjustment to the shape, it's funny, you just sometimes notice things that then irritate you. What I'd like to do to your leaves, so you should have cleaned up all the way around them. Make sure you reshape the putty rubber so that it's nice and clean, and then run it along the tips, pulling the tips out into the page. And this is going to just soften them. So it will drag a very small amount of greeny pastel out, but it should also just allow the tips to sit there, I often say, more quietly. So this is something that you can do to whiskers, for example. And with whiskers, you might not want to do it to all of the whiskers, but there might just be a few that need to sit a bit further backwards so that they are layered, you know, as the whiskers move around the form, for example. And you can do that by running your putty rubber over the top, just directly over the top. So for me, that works better because they are much softer. Now I'm going to continue reshaping the rubber, and for the back leaf, which is furthest away from us, I'm running the tip, which I've made very, very small, you can see. I'm running it directly over the top of the edge of that leaf, which is kind of blending it out, it softens it. I'm going to do the same, just coming down some of the other edges. I'm going to leave some of them sharp, the ones that are closest to us, but ones that feel a little bit grainy, for example, you can just get rid of their sharpness with your putty rubber. So you can see those small adjustments in edges, they do make quite a difference. So as you might have guessed, we're going to reshape the putty rubber and just work our way first around the tomato. Now these finishing touches can be really tempting to just sort of ignore and think, well, my drawing's finished, but they do make quite a big difference. So just really carefully reshaping the rubber. If you don't reshape it, you can drag pastel around. So again, just reshaping areas where I see the need to. Do want to be cautious about doing this because the tomato can grow larger and larger. And I am making sure that when I make an edge, or if I'm making an edge bigger, that I'm using the correct pencils in that area and blending everything in so it doesn't look like I've gone and outlined my tomato, which will flatten everything, or flatten all your hard work. Touch more red up into this section. If you look at the photograph, there is just an area where there is a little bit more colour. I mean, you can happily fiddle with this to your heart's content, which is one of the issues, but let's finish the shadow. So what I want you to do, again, the trick for this is to take your putty rubber and start working with it on a nice flat edge into your shadow. So not up into the tomato itself, just around the shadow. So you don't need a lot of pressure. And then you can take your finger, you're welcome to take your finger at this point, make sure it's clean, and just drag the shadow out. So by having used the rubber first, you shouldn't have loads of pastel on the page and it shouldn't drag too far. So the shadow is being kept really nice and simple. So we're not putting in the rest of the background and we're not expanding our pencil set with a selection of greys for it either. And there we go, 1 tomato in pastel pencils. So this is a really, really lovely way to practice blending and to think about form and light and how we create the feeling of something which is 3D. So you can see it's been done through various methods of value being the main one, the light and the dark, but then using colour to knit these values together. You can see I've done it in a variety of different subjects. I love doing the silver spoon, for example, because the values, the lights and darks on this are really easy to pick out in many respects, but then the colours that are knitting them together are really beautiful and often very subtle, but also, like the tomato, incredibly important. So I hope you have enjoyed following along with this tutorial. Again, do download the free ebook below because that is going to help you with your materials as well as your reference, and there'll be step prompts as well. Please leave me a comment if you've enjoyed this or if you have any questions, and I would love to get back to you.